What happens when a late-night comedy host pushes too hard and a royal guest decides he has had enough? The answer might shock you, because what unfolded on Stephen Colbert's stage wasn't just uncomfortable television. It was a masterclass in how quickly an interview can spiral completely out of control. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think about celebrity interviews that go wrong, because trust me, you are going to want to share your thoughts after hearing what happened here. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert had been riding high on a wave of successful celebrity interviews. The show's booking team had managed to secure some of the biggest names in entertainment, and the ratings reflected their success. So when Prince Harry's representatives reached out about a potential appearance to discuss his latest charitable initiatives, the producers knew they had struck gold. A member of the British royal family, even one who had stepped back from official duties, was still television dynamite. The initial conversations between the show's producers and Harry's team went smoothly. The prince's representatives made it clear that he wanted to focus on his humanitarian work, particularly his efforts with veterans and mental health advocacy. They emphasized that he was looking for a platform to discuss serious issues rather than engage in tabloid gossip or rehash old controversies. The Colbert team assured them that while the host might inject his trademark humor, the conversation would remain respectful and substantive. Stephen Colbert himself was genuinely excited about the booking. In private conversations with his writing team, he expressed admiration for Harry's military service and his openness about mental health struggles. The host had built his reputation on sharp political satire, but he also knew how to conduct meaningful interviews when the moment called for it. He had successfully navigated sensitive conversations with politicians, activists, and other public figures who had faced intense scrutiny. The preparation for the interview seemed thorough and professional. Harry's team provided talking points about his various charitable organizations, his work with wounded veterans, and his advocacy for mental health awareness. The show's researchers compiled background information that would allow Colbert to ask informed questions about these initiatives. Both sides seemed committed to creating compelling television that would also serve a greater purpose. However, as the interview date approached, there were subtle signs that not everyone was on the same page about the direction of the conversation. Some network executives, aware of the ratings' potential, began pushing for more provocative content. They didn't explicitly ask Colbert to ambush his guest, but they made it clear that softball questions about charity work wouldn't generate the kind of viral moments that drive social media engagement and boost viewership numbers. Colbert found himself in a familiar but uncomfortable position. He had built his career on being fearless in his questioning, never shying away from difficult topics, even when interviewing powerful figures. At the same time, he understood the importance of maintaining trust with guests and creating an environment where meaningful conversation could occur. The pressure from network executives created a tension that would ultimately influence how the interview unfolded. The day of the taping arrived with all the usual fanfare that accompanied a high-profile guest appearance. Harry arrived at the Ed Sullivan Theater in Manhattan with a small security detail and his media representative. He seemed relaxed and confident as he was escorted through the backstage area, greeting crew members warmly and even sharing a laugh with the show's musical director. During the brief pre-interview meeting, Harry and Colbert exchanged pleasantries about their respective families and shared interests. The prince mentioned his appreciation for American television and how different it was from the more formal interview formats he was accustomed to in Britain. Colbert reassured him that while the show had comedic elements, he was committed to having a substantive conversation about the issues that mattered most to his guest. The studio audience was particularly energetic that evening, having been warmed up with the promise of witnessing a historic television moment. Many of the audience members had waited hours for tickets, and the anticipation in the room was palpable. The show's warm-up comedian had prepared some royal-themed jokes, but kept them light and respectful, setting a tone that suggested the interview would be entertaining without being mean-spirited. As the cameras rolled and Colbert delivered his opening monologue, there was no indication of the drama that was about to unfold. The host performed his usual blend of political commentary and pop culture observations, drawing enthusiastic responses from the audience. When he introduced Prince Harry, the applause was thunderous and sustained, suggesting that the American audience was genuinely excited to hear from the royal guest. Harry walked onto the stage with the confident stride of someone who had spent years in the public eye. He waved to the audience, shook hands with Colbert, and settled into the guest chair with apparent ease. The first few minutes of conversation proceeded exactly as both sides had hoped, with Colbert asking thoughtful questions about Harry's transition to life in America and his adjustment to a different pace of existence outside the royal spotlight. The prince spoke eloquently about his decision to step back from royal duties, framing it as necessary for his family's well-being and his ability to pursue the causes he cared about most deeply. He discussed his military service with obvious pride, sharing stories about his deployments that revealed both his dedication to his fellow soldiers and his understanding of the sacrifices made by military families. The audience listened intently, clearly moved by his sincerity and openness. Colbert seemed genuinely engaged during these early exchanges, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he had done his homework and understood the complexity of his guest's situation. The conversation flowed naturally from Harry's military experience to his current work with veterans organizations, providing exactly the kind of platform the prince had hoped for when he agreed to appear on the show. But as the interview progressed, subtle shifts began to emerge in Colbert's questioning style. What had started as respectful curiosity began to take on a slightly more probing edge. The host began asking questions that, while not overtly hostile, seemed designed to push his guest toward more controversial territory. Harry, experienced in dealing with challenging interviews, initially navigated these moments with diplomatic skill, deflecting potentially problematic questions while maintaining his composure. The turning point came when Colbert began asking about Harry's relationship with other members of the royal family. The prince had made it clear through his representatives that this was not territory he wanted to explore during the interview, but Colbert seemed determined to test those boundaries. His questions became more direct, more personal, and clearly designed to elicit reactions rather than facilitate genuine conversation about the charitable work Harry had come to discuss. Harry's jaw tightened slightly as Colbert pressed forward with questions about family dynamics that had clearly been marked as off-limits. The prince maintained his diplomatic composure, but those familiar with reading body language could see the subtle signs of growing irritation. His posture became more rigid, his responses shorter, and there was a noticeable pause before he answered each increasingly personal question. "Stephen, I appreciate your curiosity, but I really came here tonight to talk about the work we're doing with veterans and mental health advocacy," Harry said, his voice still controlled but carrying a new edge of firmness. "These are issues that affect millions of people, and I think your audience would find those stories much more meaningful than rehashing old family disagreements." Colbert, however, seemed to interpret this redirection as an invitation to push harder rather than a clear boundary being established. The studio audience, initially enthusiastic, began to sense the shift in energy. Some viewers later described feeling uncomfortable as they watched the interview take on an adversarial tone that hadn't been present in the opening minutes. "But Harry, and I hope you don't mind me calling you Harry," Colbert continued with his trademark grin, though it seemed less genuine than usual, "your family relationships have been front-page news for years now. Surely you understand that people are curious about how you navigate those waters, especially after some of the very public statements that have been made." The prince's media training kicked in as he attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "What I've learned through my work with mental health organizations is that family relationships are complicated for everyone, not just people in the public eye. The veterans I work with often struggle with family dynamics when they return from a deployment, and that's something we can all relate to and learn from. It was a masterful deflection, turning a personal attack into an opportunity to highlight his charitable work while acknowledging universal human experiences. For a moment it seemed like the interview might return to its original trajectory. The audience appeared to appreciate this response, with several people nodding in apparent agreement with the sentiment. But Colbert wasn't ready to let go. Whether driven by network pressure, his own journalistic instincts, or simply the momentum of live television, he decided to press even further into territory that Harry's team had explicitly marked as problematic. That's a beautiful sentiment. Harry, really it is, Colbert said, his tone taking on a slightly mocking quality that regular viewers would recognize as his preparation for a more aggressive line of questioning. But let's be honest here. When you and your wife made certain accusations about your family, particularly regarding issues of race and mental health support, you opened a door to public scrutiny. Don't you think the public deserves some clarity about those very serious allegations? The change in Harry's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. His entire body language shifted from diplomatic caution to barely contained anger. The prince sat forward in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests, and for the first time since the interview began, he looked directly into Colbert's eyes, with an intensity that made the host momentarily uncomfortable. "I think what the public deserves," Harry said, his voice now carrying a sharp edge that cut through the studio's atmosphere, "is for media personalities to show some basic respect for the boundaries that guests establish when they agree to appear on their programs. I was very clear about what I was willing to discuss tonight, and you're deliberately choosing to ignore those boundaries." The studio fell silent. Even the usually responsive audience seemed to hold their collective breath as they witnessed what was clearly becoming a confrontation rather than an interview. Camera operators adjusted their positions slightly, sensing that they were capturing something that would be replayed and analyzed for days to come. Colbert, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far but unable to back down without losing face, decided to double down on his approach. "Harry, with all due respect, you can't make explosive public statements about your family and then expect journalists to never ask you about them. That's not how media works, especially when you choose to appear on American television." Explosive public statements? Harry's voice rose slightly, though he still maintained enough control to avoid shouting. "I shared my personal experiences about mental health struggles and my family's response to them. I did so to help other people who might be going through similar situations. But apparently you and your network see that vulnerability as nothing more than entertainment fodder." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Colbert's usual quick wit seemed to abandon him as he processed the direct nature of Harry's criticism. The host had built his career on being the one asking uncomfortable questions, not on being called out by his guests for his methods. "Now, hold on just a minute," Colbert responded, his own voice taking on a defensive tone. "I'm not trying to exploit anyone's vulnerability. I'm asking legitimate questions that any journalist would ask when interviewing someone who has made such significant public statements about their family relationships." "Legitimate questions?" Harry stood up abruptly, his movement so sudden that it caused a visible reaction from the studio crew. "You mean the same legitimate questions that have been asked 1,000 times by tabloid reporters looking for their next headline? I thought American television was supposed to be different. More substantive. I thought you were different." The personal nature of that last comment clearly stung Colbert. His professional composure began to crack as he realized the interview was spiraling completely out of his control. "Harry, please sit down. Let's try to have a rational conversation about this." "Rational?" Harry's laugh was bitter and completely devoid of humor. "There's nothing rational about ambushing a guest who came here in good faith to discuss important charitable work. You've spent the last 10 minutes trying to get me to rehash personal family matters for your audience's entertainment, completely ignoring the actual purpose of this appearance." The prince began moving toward the edge of the interview area, clearly preparing to leave. His security detail, who had been positioned discreetly off-camera, began to shift their positions, reading the situation and preparing to escort him from the studio if necessary. Colbert made one last attempt to salvage the interview, perhaps realizing that having a guest storm off his show would create exactly the kind of viral moment the network wanted, but not in a way that would reflect well on his interviewing skills. "Harry, please, let's take a breath here. I apologize if my questions seemed intrusive. Why don't we start over and focus on the veteran's work you wanted to discuss? But the damage was already done." Harry turned back to face Colbert, and the look of disappointment and anger on his face was unmistakable. "You know what, Stephen? I've spent years dealing with journalists who prioritize sensationalism over substance, who see my personal struggles as content for their shows rather than as human experiences that might actually help people. I genuinely thought you were different. I thought this show was different." The studio audience watched in stunned silence as one of the most dramatic confrontations in late-night television history continued to unfold. Some audience members later reported feeling genuinely uncomfortable, as if they were witnessing something too personal and raw for public consumption. "I prepared for this interview in good faith," Harry continued, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had been raised to command attention when he spoke. "I came here with stories about veterans who are struggling, about young people dealing with mental health challenges, about real issues that affect real people. But all you want to talk about is family drama that you think will get you better. Ratings." Colbert opened his mouth to respond, but Harry wasn't finished. The prince had clearly reached his breaking point, and years of dealing with intrusive media coverage seemed to pour out in this moment of confrontation. "You want to know what's really disappointing?" Harry continued, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the studio. "I've watched your show, Stephen. I've seen you conduct brilliant interviews with politicians, activists, and other public figures. You know how to ask tough questions while still maintaining respect for your guests. But tonight, you've chosen to act like every other tabloid journalist who thinks my pain is your entertainment." Colbert's face flushed red as the criticism hit home. He had built his reputation on being fearless but fair, and having a guest publicly call out his integrity on live television was perhaps the worst professional nightmare he could imagine. "Harry, that's not fair. I'm doing my job as a journalist." "Your job?" Harry's voice rose with incredulity. "Your job is to inform and entertain your audience, not to re-traumatize guests for ratings. Do you have any idea what it's like to have your most vulnerable moments dissected for public consumption over and over again? Do you understand the impact that has on someone's mental health?" The personal nature of Harry's words seemed to strike something deep within Colbert. For a moment his defensive posture wavered, and there was a flicker of what might have been genuine remorse in his eyes. But the moment passed quickly as his professional instincts took over. "I understand that you're upset, but you chose to make these matters public when you gave that interview. You can't expect journalists to never ask about them," Colbert said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "That interview was about helping people," Harry shot back, his frustration now fully visible. "It was about showing others who are struggling that they're not alone, that even people in privileged positions face mental health challenges. But people like you have turned it into gossip, into entertainment, into something to be picked apart and analyzed for your audience's amusement." The studio cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of this unprecedented confrontation. Camera operators and crew members exchanged glances, knowing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The audience sat in uncomfortable silence, many of them clearly sympathizing with Harry's position despite their loyalty to Colbert. "You know what the real tragedy is here?" Harry continued, his voice now carrying a tone of profound disappointment. "There are veterans sitting at home right now who are struggling with post-traumatic stress, who are having trouble reconnecting with their families, who are contemplating suicide because they don't see a way forward. I came here tonight with stories that could have helped them, with resources that could have saved lives, but instead, you wanted to talk about family drama. The weight of that statement settled over the studio like a heavy blanket. Even Colbert seemed momentarily speechless, as he processed the implications of what his guest was saying. The host had always prided himself on using his platform for important causes, and being told that he had squandered an opportunity to help people clearly affected him. "Harry, please, let's refocus. We can still talk about the veterans' work," Colbert said, his voice now carrying a note of desperation, as he realized how badly the interview had gone off the rails. But Harry was already moving toward the stage exit, his security team falling into step behind him. "No, Stephen, you had your chance to do something meaningful tonight, and you chose sensationalism instead. You chose to treat me like a character in a soap opera rather than someone who genuinely wants to make a difference." The prince paused at the edge of the stage and turned back to face Colbert one final time. "You know what's really sad? Your audience deserves better than this. They deserve substantive conversations about issues that matter. They deserve to hear about solutions to problems rather than just gossip about famous people's personal lives." "Harry, please don't leave like this," Colbert pleaded, but his words fell on deaf ears. "I'm leaving because I have more respect for your audience than you apparently do," Harry replied, his voice now cold and final. "They came here tonight expecting to learn something, to be inspired, to hear about ways they could help their communities. Instead, you've given them a Jerry Springer episode with better lighting." The comparison to daytime tabloid television was perhaps the most cutting insult Harry could have delivered. Colbert visibly winced at the words, knowing that his guest had identified exactly what he had feared the interview might become. "This is what's wrong with media today," Harry continued, his voice now carrying the authority of someone delivering a verdict. "You have platforms that could educate, inspire, and heal, but instead you choose to sensationalize and exploit. You wonder why people don't trust journalists anymore? This is why." With that devastating final statement, Harry turned and walked off the stage, leaving Colbert standing alone in front of his stunned audience. The host attempted to regain his composure, but the damage was clearly done. His usual quick wit had abandoned him, and for several long seconds he simply stood there, processing what had just happened. The studio audience sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in stunned quiet. Many of them had come expecting to see their favorite late-night host conduct another entertaining interview, but instead they had witnessed what felt more like a public breakdown of trust between media and its subjects. Colbert finally found his voice, though it lacked its usual confidence. "Well, that was certainly unexpected," he said, attempting to inject some humor into the moment. But the laughter from the audience was scattered and uncomfortable, reflecting the general unease in the room. "We're going to take a quick commercial break," Colbert announced, his voice still shaky. "When we come back, we'll have our musical guest, and hopefully we can end tonight on a more positive note." As the cameras cut away and the show went to commercial, the studio remained eerily quiet. Crew members whispered among themselves, "Audience." Members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Colbert stood alone on his stage, clearly struggling to process what had just transpired. Behind the scenes, network executives were already in crisis mode, trying to determine how to handle the fallout from what was clearly going to be one of the most talked-about television moments of the year. The raw, unfiltered nature of Harry's criticism had been captured in real time, and there was no way to minimize or spin what had happened. The interview had started with such promise, both sides genuinely hoping to create meaningful television that would serve a greater purpose. Instead, it had devolved into a public confrontation that revealed the deep tensions between celebrity culture, media responsibility, and the human cost of public scrutiny. As Harry left the building, surrounded by his security team, he carried with him not just his own disappointment but a broader frustration with a media landscape that seemed more interested in conflict than in solutions. The veterans he had hoped to help, the mental health advocates he had planned to support, the young people struggling with their own challenges, all of them would have to wait for another platform, another opportunity to have their stories told. The confrontation between Prince Harry and Stephen Colbert had lasted less than 20 minutes, but its impact would be felt far beyond that studio in Manhattan. It was a moment that crystallized the ongoing debate about media responsibility, celebrity privacy, and the price of public service in an age of endless scrutiny. So what do you think? Was Harry justified in his anger, or should public figures expect tough questions when they appear on television? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about the moments when live television goes completely off script.